Welcome to Making an Impact. I'm Katie Mills, the head of Zygo Power at Schneider Electric. And in this podcast, we meet incredible individuals from a range of industries to discuss the exciting projects they're involved with today, their career journey to date, and ultimately what impact their work is having on the world. In this episode, we are making an impact with Alex Howard, head of flexibility markets at UK Power Networks. His career has allowed him to help maintain the electricity cables and lines across London, the South East and East of England, making sure power flows reliably, safely and securely. We're hearing about how smart and sustainable grids can improve efficiency and enhance reliability, all whilst facilitating the transition to a low-carbon economy in modernised electricity infrastructure. So welcome, Alex, to Making an Impact.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
So Alex, you are head of flexibility markets at UK Power Networks.
Yep.
Explain to our audience, what does UK Power Networks do? What is it responsible for?
So UK Power Networks is what we call a distribution network operator. So it means that we own the substations and the wires that bring electricity into about 8.5 million homes and businesses in the southeast. So we cover London, the southeast of England and East Anglia. There's also National Grid, and you can think of National Grid as running the kind of motorways for electricity and us running the A and B roads that get to people's homes.
Okay, awesome. And head of flexibility markets, what does that mean? What does that do?
That's a good question. I think even within UK Power Networks, there are people that would ask me the same question. So flexibility markets is quite a new thing for distribution networks, but the idea is basically that we work with our customers, so we work with people who are connected to the network to change when they're using power, when they're generating power, basically to kind of squeeze more out of the existing grid. So rather than having really high peaks for an hour a day and then low utilization the rest of the day, we can kind of smooth out some of those peaks and as a result squeeze more electric vehicles or heat pumps or renewables onto the existing network.
Okay, and so when we talk about flexibility, why is it important now more than ever when we think of renewable energy, for example, hitting kind of, decarbonisation goals? Why is it such an important piece?
Yeah, so if I kind of think back to kind of how distribution networks used to be, I mean, the demand for power would kind of increase with GDP, with kind of new housing developments, maybe some new businesses in the area. And so you'd gradually build up the network. You might have to upgrade a substation, but it was quite predictable. It was relatively slow. And we now find ourselves in a bit of a race to decarbonise, where a lot of the bets that we're placing are around electrification. So moving stuff from petrol and diesel to electricity, moving stuff from gas to heat your home to electricity. And so if we just carry on the old model of kind of, we build more network when people need more electricity, we're going to end up spending billions and billions of pounds digging up lots of roads. And flexibility gives us a kind of alternative and basically says you can use this network smarter. Yes, you're still going to need more wires, more substations over the next few decades, but you can get a long way with actually just being smarter with what you got.
Mm-hmm. And so when we think about, you just touched upon it there, electrification.
Yeah.
We hear it all the time right now when it comes to, the route to net zero, the path to net zero. But we also hear about constraints when it comes to electrification, especially from a grid perspective.
Yeah.
We had the Port of Dover on here who were, struggling with connection to the grid when it comes to electrification and just the sheer volume that they need.
Yep.
How are you tackling that? How are you seeing that challenge of electrification? And, how can you, I suppose, future-proof the business to be able to deal with that as it continues to increase from a demand perspective?
Yeah, so I think there are kind of two routes, crudely. So one is you just build lots more network. You try and get ahead of this and you say, look, in 2050, the system is going to look very different. So let's have a distribution network that's 2-3 times the size of today. The alternative is perhaps kind of harder to explain, but perhaps easier to kind of actually execute, which is we need to get closer to our customers. So Port of Dover being an example, to understand kind of what are their plans and feed that into our forecast, look at different ways that we might be able to connect them, look at, do they need that access to the network 24/7? Are there technologies that they could install on site that mean that they wouldn't need that? So could they have on-site solar? Could they have on-site batteries? Would that help? I think flexibility markets also plays into that we can look at, okay, so if a big site like a port is trying to decarbonize, is there other demand in the area that might be able to not kind of use electricity at that same time? And so we've had quite a lot of success over the last 2-3 years engaging domestic consumers in particular to say, actually, could you charge your car at a different time or run your heat pump slightly differently in order that we can accommodate some of these new loads? Ports are an example. Data centers are probably kind of the other one that's front of mind at the moment.
And let's touch upon data centers. It's a big hot topic right now.
Yeah.
AI, increasing, usage and need. How do you deal with that? How are you planning for that for the future? Because, the plans are it's only going to continue to increase, which puts even more pressure from a data center perspective on the network. So how do you guys view that right now?
So it's quite an acute challenge at the moment. So I think that the kind of before I came to UK Power Networks, I probably thought, well, you know what, we've got a lot of wind in Scotland. Like surely the data centers will want to be kind of where all that cheap green power is. And I think there's a little bit of that happening, but we've also been inundated with requests to connect new data centers around London. And the fact is that kind of there's good fiber connectivity. And so, yes, land prices are sky high. Yes, it's hard to get a grid connection. But that's what customers want. So we have to find a way to serve that. So we have already a few dozen data centers connected in our area. We've been kind of digging into how do they use the network today? Kind of can we be a little bit less conservative in kind of what assumptions we make about future data centers in order to get people connected sooner? But we're also setting up a series of engagements in the new year to get closer to those data center companies and understand they want to get connected faster, but kind of how can we work together to make that happen? So I think collaboration is probably kind of the kind of umbrella for where I see the kind of opportunity there, that rather than they arrive and say we need 300 megawatts, kind of when can you do it? We look at kind of where's the flexibility to kind of do things differently and get a better outcome.
Yeah, it's interesting that word collaboration comes up time and time again, right? When we speak about sustainability, when we speak about, even, to all of our impact makers, the need to collaborate across industry, across sector, is so important for us to get anywhere near targets that we have. So when we talk about a sustainable grid, and we hear that term a lot right now, 2030 is on the horizon. People have a lot of net zero targets for 2030. What does it mean to UK Power Networks to be a sustainable grid?
Yes, there's a lot of jargon in this industry, and sustainable grid actually probably don't use as much as kind of some of the other terms. But I think for me, there's a few angles to a sustainable grid. So first of all, maybe this is the most obvious one, but I think grids are kind of the platform for a lot of the decarbonisation work we want to do. So the kind of sexy applications are electric vehicles and heat pumps and heat networks and renewables, but you need to have the kind of platform in place. And I think it's acknowledged that kind of you need a kind of efficient, well-performing grid in order to do all that work. So that's the first thing. I think we need to be in a position where the grid doesn't cost the earth, and we're not kind of actually making net zero harder for ourselves by saying, you know what, this can be really expensive. There's only one place that expense goes, which is people's bills. So I think there's an element to kind of sustainable grid that we have to keep the cost down.
Yep.
Otherwise, this net zero journey is going to be a faltering one, certainly. I think,
I suppose, sorry, just to butt in there, I
yeah.
suppose it's not just about sustainability for the planet, but it's for the people on it, right, as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the grid has to be here long term and we have to be able to afford it long term. So I get your point, kind of many angles to sustainable grid, not just climate change, shall we say.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, so climate change, I think, is the kind of most obvious one. It's the reason that kind of I find this so interesting and the kind of gets you out of bed and kind of forming some of those collaborations. But equally, there's some other things that kind of, if we totally forget about them, they're probably going to blow up in our face.
Yep, absolutely. And you touched upon earlier the domestic market.
Yeah.
What role does the domestic market play when we talk about, the grid of the future or your flexibility piece around the grid?
Yeah.
What role does the domestic market play?
So I've been in the space for about 10 years now. And when I first started and talking about flexibility, everything was like grid scale. And frankly, like most of the flexibility we had was kind of diesel generators, gas generators of different forms. And that has really started to change over the last kind of 2-3 years. I think the kind of watershed moment was probably what happened in Ukraine, which then led to kind of can we keep the lights on kind of the following winter, which then led National Grid to really be looking at kind of all options for balancing the grid, starting this thing called the Demand Flexibility Service, and then finding that actually there were millions of people that kind of were prepared to do something a bit different. And that, quite honestly, that kind of surprised me. Like, I always thought that this would be kind of big stuff would go first because there's a good business case, you've got economies of scale, blah, 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 and that the kind of domestic stuff would be really hard to move. But I think we've proven that there's something there, like it works. People want some agency in this net zero transition, and this is maybe a little way that we can kind of make them feel part of that without necessarily having to buy an electric vehicle or a heat pump and install solar panels on the roof. I think the reality though is that we're still in the early days. So yes, there are kind of 1 or 2 million people who participate in those kind of schemes, but we have 30 million properties. So let's not kid ourselves that kind of everyone is thinking in this way. It's still the early adopters. But I think if we can get a few things in place, a few things kind of right, we can make that jump from it being just for the early adopters to actually this could be something that benefits everyone, could be something that becomes a bit more normal.
Yep. What do you think are those things that we have to put in place to make that jump? What are we missing at the moment?
So I think the first thing that we're missing is probably the kind of awareness piece. So to outsiders, including my family, like energy is super complicated, and flexibility is like a kind of niche area of energy, right? So I think kind of our first challenge is like explaining this to kind of ordinary people, like what is it? Why should they be involved? I think you then have a challenge about some of the processes and systems that we kind of operate in the industry, which in large part were never geared towards this kind of thing. They were kind of geared towards, well, we'll have 200, maybe 300 large generators and kind of those things can install their own computers on site, and we'll have kind of dedicated fiber that communicates with them. And we're now like, whoa, and none of that is remotely relevant to kind of getting this to the mass market. So I think there's that side of things too. I think we probably have to be a bit more creative about kind of propositions in energy. So I think that we've kind of squeezed energy retailers quite hard to reduce costs, and we've made switching easier, and that has given some benefits in terms of the kind of cost of energy over the past decade or so. But we need to also encourage those retailers to kind of think a bit about not just kind of billing people for each kilowatt hour, but helping them decarbonize and kind of winning their trust and getting them to participate a bit more. And we've seen some suppliers kind of jump at that, and others probably it's been kind of harder to get them to that point. But I'd love to see kind of over the next 5-10 years more of our energy suppliers think a bit more than kind of my business is selling as many kilowatt hours as I possibly can.
Do you see any shift in business model in this space that is really helping that transition?
So I think one of the ones to watch probably, and maybe it's not a shift in business model yet, is stuff like the kind of Octopus zero bills kind of proposition where you're kind of bundling in lots of technologies which help you decarbonize with then quite a simple, compelling proposition to the customer. Well, you're not going to pay for your energy for 10 years. I mean, that isn't for everyone. And at the moment, that's kind of limited to like new homes. But this idea that you might have companies who are prepared to pay for your charge point or pay for your heat pump in return for a kind of longer customer relationship. I think that's got legs. I think kind of if they can also help reduce complexity for kind of people who are trying to find their way through how do I do the right thing and keep my costs down, then I think we've got a hope. I think the more we ask homeowners to engage with kind of 5 or 6 different companies in order to kind of find their way through this, the more we'll find that is only for the very few that have the time and inclination to do it.
Yep, absolutely. I feel this pain myself because we electrified our home when we renovated it 3 years ago, and it cost us
congratulations.
It was great at the time, and now it costs us an absolute fortune.
Well, I mean, that is also one of the problems, right? That we have to make sure that kind of the people who make that right decision, and what like loads of people in the industry would see as the right decision, then feel that in their pockets. They're being rewarded for it rather than kind of continually kind of reminded.
And it goes even further than just energy. So this is a very personal kind of anecdote, but recently selling our house, having an EPC rating done, because we have an electric boiler, actually you end up with a far worse EPC rating because of the cost, obviously, of running it. And we were like, hang on, we're being penalised now for doing the right thing versus actually, you know, being praised for doing the right thing. So, and look, I appreciate we're in a very fortunate position to be able to take that additional cost on. But yeah, look, if you want to drive the masses, we have to tackle that because that's not sustainable for most people.
Yeah, and I think the government is in the middle of trying to reform the EPCs to try to kind of tease apart the kind of environmental performance of your home from perhaps the cost performance and maybe even the kind of the flexibility, the kind of smartness of your home, which I think if it's done well could be great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like we have to avoid kind of swamping people in kind of loads of data that they can't. So there's something nice in like having just a letter which, you know, kind of A is good, F is bad. But also we've tried to load so much into EPCs that they don't really do anything
100%.
well anymore. So
when taking it back to the grid, when we speak about a green grid, naturally that means more renewables.
Yeah.
And with more renewables comes more unpredictability, shall we say?
Yeah.
How do you manage that from a networks perspective? And what are the kind of measures that you are starting to put in place to help manage that? What are the technologies that exist that can really help from that perspective?
So it's probably worth saying that as a network company, we're stacked with electrical engineers, and they tend to be fairly risk averse. So I think kind of it's been a bit of a journey, like taking on more solar and wind over the last decade, and quite a lot. So we We have a peak demand in our region of about 14 gigawatts and now about 10 gigawatts of distributed generation. So we're still kind of at peak, at least, a kind of net importer from other parts of the country. But there is a lot now of solar and wind connected. And I think one of the things we did probably close to 10 years ago now was introduce this thing called flexible connections. And the idea here was basically we can run all kinds of models and power flow analyses and kind of identify lots of worst case scenarios and say, no, you can't connect to the grid because you know what, if it's super sunny and super windy all over our patch, that's going to create a problem for us. Or we can use technology a bit more. And so we introduced this thing called flexible connections. It basically means that people can get connected faster and cheaper, but they lose that guarantee of having 24/7 access. In reality, the level of that we need to kind of turn down their access to the grid is pretty modest. So it was less than 1% last year. And so actually it's for solar and wind, it's worked really well. That actually, yeah, so when there's loads and loads of renewables on the grid and actually prices are pretty low, then they can't export their energy, but they're prepared to make that trade-off in return for being connected much earlier. I think that doesn't replace the need to kind of build the grid and kind of there are bits of East Anglia certainly where that kind of what we call curtailment, that kind of not having enough capacity locally to distribute all those kind of green electrons, it is kind of more of an issue. And that's actually been kind of one of the areas where we've used flexibility in perhaps kind of the opposite way to how people might expect. So rather than asking people to reduce demand during peak times, we've said, actually tomorrow, you know what, we think we're going to have too much renewables in this area. There's a risk that we're going to have to throw some of this away. So if you can turn up your demand between 1 and 2 o'clock, actually we'll kind of incentivize that. We'll give you a payment for that, because otherwise we're going to end up kind of wasting that renewable energy. And that's gone down quite well with people because all of a sudden this whole kind of net zero thing, starting to see some of the benefits.
It's not just the cost anymore, right? There is a payback on it. And what role do you see storage playing in this? Because we hear about, the need for investment in storage, especially when we're, dealing with far more renewables on our grid.
Yep.
What role do you see storage playing in this?
So I think storage is going to play a huge role. So already the UK is seeing quite a considerable build out in grid scale storage. So when I started in the industry 10 years ago, one of the first things I did was a project looking at kind of the economics of grid scale storage. And at the time, batteries were very expensive.
Yep.
So there were returns to be had, but it was a pretty risky business. There were no subsidies in the same way that there were for solar and wind, and investors were a bit nervous. I think kind of probably kind of 5-6 years ago, that changed a bit. National Grid made it kind of clear that you could get some long-term contracts, and actually people kind of, with that certainty, just kind of rolled into the space, and that's continued. So we now have kind of hundreds of megawatts of storage connected to our network, and gigawatts, so kind of 10 times more storage kind of in the queue wanting to connect than we currently have today. I think the challenge with storage has been a little bit like with wind and solar about kind of how do you predict what it's going to do, kind of. And again, I think kind of the temptation is to go for worst case and kind of think, well, you know what, when we're seeing the highest possible demand on our network, maybe this thing is going to be kind of sucking in even more power. And so one of the things we've had to dig into over the last kind of year or two is what do they actually do, and kind of demystify, de-fear some of this and go, well, actually, It's pretty good kind of economic incentive for storage to do the opposite and help out. And so when prices are high and demand on the grid is really high, storage can be discharging and actually kind of providing a source of kind of clean power across the grid. I don't pretend it's going to be easy connecting kind of 10 times more over the next few years than we have in the kind of last 5-6 years or so, but that's the challenge for us, and it's pretty clear, I think, that at least at grid scale, storage is going to be a big part of how we hit net zero.
Do you need help calculating and tracking your carbon emissions? Use Zygo Activate decarbonisation software to calculate Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, track your progress, and reduce your carbon footprint. Search Zygo Activate and request your free demo today. So, moving on to you personally, Alex. Yeah. Well, as you said, your family are like, well, what is energy? What do you do? What made you move into this space? What made you go, I know, career in energy, that's where I'm going? Or was it by chance, potentially?
So yeah, somewhat embarrassingly, it was by chance. And I see a lot more people now actually kind of making that conscious decision that they want to be involved in net zero, they want to be in energy, and I think that is awesome. And actually, I've seen some really great people join the industry like reasonably recently, having had careers elsewhere. I think so. So my journey, I spent the first half of my career so far kind of outside energy, doing some very interesting work, always very challenging, but never really feeling like the kind of problem that I was trying to solve was kind of something that I was attached to for the long term. And I fell into energy because I was working for a very big organization. I was churning out PowerPoint slide after PowerPoint slide for the board and the exec. And I was whinging about it to a friend in the pub who said, well, I've been working with this startup and I don't know how it'll turn out, but like, it's pretty interesting. Like intellectually, you'll kind of find it a challenge, but also like, there's no time to be churning out slides that don't do anything. So you'll be busy kind of having an impact some way or another. And it happened to be in energy. I mean, it was a startup that had raised a little bit of money to build software to help manage all of these kind of pieces of flexibility, and basically how do you coordinate them to do the right thing for the grid and make someone some money somewhere. And I haven't looked back, to be honest. Like it's been quite a journey, but I think the industry has kept changing around me, but it's also pretty clear that we're not going to find a silver bullet, a kind of quick solution to net zero. And that's quite, I mean, much as I'd like that to not be the case, the kind of silver lining to it is we're going to have very interesting careers for the next kind of, probably to retirement, to be honest. So 2050 will be kind of hoping to be on a beach pretty soon after that, if it's not too hot. But in the meantime, there's really rewarding work to be done. It's nice to feel like the problem that you're trying to solve is it is kind of a worthwhile problem. So yeah, all of the companies that I've worked with have been trying to make money as well, but they've also had quite a long-term view on kind of the way that we're going to make money is by kind of embracing this change that needs to happen, rather than kind of short-term, how do we kind of find loopholes or kind of make a quick buck and not fix the big problems.
Sounds to me like you found your purpose, right?
Yeah, but not in a very deliberate way. And I think that's okay, right? Like I think there's a lot of people who kind of accidentally kind of find their way through. I've been one of those, but I definitely encourage people who are kind of thinking about this space to kind of definitely consider it, even if they think, oh yeah, but I've just spent the last 10 years working in financial services or comms, or like the other thing that I found kind of quite interesting, we mentioned collaboration earlier, but like net zero isn't like a technical problem, or it's not just a technical problem.
Yeah.
There's so many different angles to it, whether it's kind of how we engage customers, whether it's kind of how we kind of sew together the kind of efforts of different kind of bits of the supply chain, that I think we kind of need all of our best people to kind of come together on this.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think what's really interesting to hear, and we see it probably, I see it on my side too, is the drive that people have to do something that's worthwhile now, not just to make some money. I think also, to your point, the diverse backgrounds are really important, right? Because yeah, you might come from financial services, but ultimately, if you know how to, if you're a problem solver, then net zero is the place to be, right? Because we've got a lot of problems to solve.
And there's a lot of money.
100%.
They're going to need to be invested.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, you just look at like all industries, right? Like whether it's kind of the legal one or financial services, and all of them cut across.
Yeah, they all touch it.
The problems we're trying to solve.
Absolutely. It's like net zero is the core thread, right? That ties a lot of it all together. So
yeah.
always a need for people from all different backgrounds.
Yeah.
You mentioned 2050.
Yes.
I appreciate you might be on your beach in the Caribbean somewhere with your pina colada in hand. However,
yeah,
when we look at 2050 and the grid of the future, if you could wave that magic wand, what would the grid ideally look like in 2050?
That's a great question. I mean, I'd probably widen it slightly from the grid, but I'd like to think that while we're kind of solving for net zero, we don't forget like the people in this, and we end up in a world where energy is cheaper and fairer than it is today. So kind of I don't dream of a kind of world where yes, everything is renewable, but you know what, no one can really afford to kind of do all the things that they want to do. Like I don't think that's what we aspire to. I don't think that long term people will be prepared to kind of vote for that, pay for that, etc. So I'd like to think that this is an opportunity, if we're going to rip up a load of processes and systems and invest loads in kind of new assets, that we think about, okay, right, how do we set up the grid and energy as a platform for prosperity and GB and kind of fairness of kind of people have the kind of fundamental things they need to live their lives, do good jobs, etc.
Yep. And leads me nicely to my final question, which is the question that I ask everyone who comes on the podcast.
Okay.
Is this podcast is obviously called Making an Impact.
Yeah.
When you're long gone and your children are talking to their grandchildren, shall we say?
Yeah.
What's the impact that you hope you've left behind?
What a great question. And this isn't one that probably I kind of think about explicitly every day, but I like to think of myself as kind of trying to bring people together. So that's one of the things that I really love about my current job, is that kind of it's not buried deep in UK Power Networks, and we never kind of touch kind of customers and all of that kind of stuff. But I really love the kind of collaboration side of things, the partnering side of things, the reaching outside your box kind of thing. So I'd like to think that there would be bits that I could point to, and maybe none of it would be bits that I achieved by myself, but to say that kind of I brought these things together in order to solve a big problem. And I think probably problem solving is kind of one of the things that's been a core throughout my career, but that collaboration piece I've maybe only become more confident in it later on, that it's not about kind of one person being a superhero. It's very much a kind of team game, and sometimes you're playing with people that you know, but a lot of the time also we're kind of forming new connections and working out, okay, well, I never thought about it from that perspective before, but maybe actually if we work together we could do something different. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, Alex, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
And to you, thank you.
Thanks.